All right, good morning. Welcome back, everybody. It's always a little bittersweet to engage in the last lecture of the semester. I want to thank you all for what's been a good semester, at least as far as I can tell. I want to spend today talking about communication beyond speech. We've spent a lot of the time this semester in lecture talking about the history of public speaking. I'm going to give you a little bit of that history today and talk about how it relates to the history of communication, especially as it's studied in the United States. But I also want you to recognize that there's a lot more to communication than just public speaking. There's a little bit of a tragedy of teaching what we often in communication refer to as the basic course, the way that most people teach it. For most universities, if you're going to take a required course in communication, public speaking is the #1 course that you're going to take. And the reason for that is pretty simple. A lot of universities see it as important for you to learn public speaking skills. For better or worse, a lot of them see it as primarily important for you to help you on the job market, although as we've talked about, there are a lot of other uses for public speaking that happen in your personal life as well. But there's a tragedy to having public speaking being the one and only course that a lot of students take if they're not going to take other classes in communication. And there's two reasons why that's kind of tragic. The first is thinking about the basic course as anything but basic. I recognize, and I talked to you all on the first day of class about how I'm up against a big challenge at the beginning of every semester. I'm up against that same challenge for a lot of you throughout the whole semester and sometimes even beyond the semester. And that challenge is a lot of people walk in on day one of a class in public speaking and they already don't like the subject matter. They already don't think they're good at it. It's not something that comes naturally to them. It's not something that they're interested in. It's not something that they're very excited about. On the first day of class, you might remember I asked you all why you were here, and I asked you to shout it all at once, and you all said the #1 answer, and I kind of did my Louis Anderson Family Feud bit of, it's required. That's usually the #1 answer for why people take public speaking in the first place, and I recognize that if you were to take a required class, that doesn't exactly make it sound fun, that doesn't necessarily make it sound engaging, and I see it as my personal challenge, but also one of my personal points of pride in teaching this class is to try and make it relevant and interesting to you. I recognize that some of you, after 16 weeks in public speaking, are not still particularly excited about it. That's okay. It's not necessarily my job to make you think public speaking is the most exciting thing ever. I'll tell you that I teach a lot of classes, and public speaking is the one I've taught most often, but I generally enjoy teaching my other classes a little bit more because the students actually want to be there. That said, I also recognize that public speaking is an important skill for a lot of you, and I want, at the very least, if you don't like public speaking any more than you did 16 weeks ago, I'm hoping that you at least learn some new strategies for doing it a little bit better. A lot of the reason why people don't like public speaking is because they don't think they're very good at it, and they get nervous. I've tried to give you a lot of different strategies this semester to help you get better at public speaking. You've had a lot of opportunities to speak in lab and get better by practicing public speaking as well. But I nevertheless recognize the Jerry Seinfeld quote that I mentioned on the first day of class, that if you're at a funeral, most people would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy. So I recognize a lot of you probably don't like public speaking to begin with. My hope is at the very least that you like it a little bit, or you hate it a little bit less than you did at the beginning of the semester. My hope is that if you don't love it now, that you'll learn to love it or learn to at least appreciate it over time. And if nothing else, that you've gained some valuable skills from being here. But I also recognize that there's a challenge of treating public speaking as the basic course, in that it's not very basic for a lot of people. And if people think that public speaking is all that communication majors do, if a lot of people don't like public speaking, why would they ever take any other classes in communication? It's probably not the best strategy for us long term if we're going to try and get other people to major in communication. And so part of what I'm going to do today is give you a history of public speaking as it relates to other classes in communication. The other challenge of thinking of public speaking as the basic course is that for some of you, public speaking is actually something pretty easy. And if public speaking comes naturally to you and it's the only class you take, it contributes to that mentality that we talked about around the time that we talked about your Techne speeches of communication just being a slacker major. Communication being a subject that's not really worthy of university study, communication being a subject that's not really all that relevant or all that important. It's not like it's the same as engineering or aviation or whatever you all are majoring in. And I'll tell you that I took a lot of classes in communication, and part of what drew me to communication is because it's an interdisciplinary discipline. That is, you have to know a little bit about every other field at the university. And part of what I liked about communication is that you have to kind of become an expert in a lot of things that are interesting. So when I was an undergrad, I was interested in sociology, I was interested in history, I was interested in philosophy, I was interested in literature, I was interested in psychology. All of that came together to help me do my research on communication and violence, and it's threads that continue to this day. But part of the challenge of that is you have to be kind of an expert in everything. So some of the communication classes that I had were actually some of the hardest classes I ever took at the university, and that's part of why I decided to pursue it, because I enjoyed the challenge. So there's actually a lot that you can do with communication, and I want you all to have a better sense of what communication as a field looks like. But the history and the practice of communication in universities in the United States and elsewhere in the 21st century is very heavily bound up in the study of speech. And so I want to continue our discussion of the history and theory of public speaking today to give you a better appreciation of what I'm having you do and why I'm having you do it. So one of the things that you all need to recognize is that your tradition of public speaking is one that we've talked about many times in this class as going back about 2,500 years. A lot of people in ancient Greece were really interested in the study of public speaking, and you can track over 2,500 years since Plato and Aristotle and the Sophists, some times when public speaking and the study of rhetoric has gone in and out of fashion. There have been a lot of times where people have said the study of speech, the study of rhetoric is really important. There have been a lot of times when people say the study of speech is really bad and actually kind of dangerous. This is the critique that rhetoric is just all fluff and no substance, that it's mere rhetoric, and it collapses rhetoric down to style. And the only thing that really matters is if you can say things in a way that sounds pretty. Those are some of the lowest moments in rhetoric, when rhetoric gets collapsed down to style. You all know that rhetoric has much more to offer than that. I've given you a lot of the other canons and a lot of the other history of rhetoric to help you expand and think about not just the other canons, but also about argumentation and persuasion. Now, I'll tell you that the times in history when rhetoric has fallen in fashion and in study have been times that have coincided with good moments in democracy. There's a reason why rhetoric was popular in ancient Greece. There's a reason why rhetoric was popular in ancient Rome. There's a reason why rhetoric became popular again after World War II, when democracies around the world were collapsing. So there's a lot of rise and fall of the history of rhetoric. There's a lot of rise and fall of that with the history of civic and community engagement. And so you all are part of a tradition that's been spanning for about 2,500 years. And I want to give you the tools to help you speak better so that you can participate in a variety of contexts. I want you to be able to speak in professional contexts, because that's what the university wants for you. That's what's going to help you all when you have your careers. But I also want you to speak well in ceremonial contexts. I want you to speak well in civic and community engagement contexts. And so I've given you a lot of tools that you can use throughout your time, and so you can speak up and have more of a voice. Now, there are a lot of people who have argued historically that rhetoric is not something worthy of study. Plato, who coined the term techne, said that rhetoric was not a techne. It was not an art worthy of study. It wasn't something that anyone can or should become a specialist in. And that mentality has persisted even into the 21st century. There are a lot of people who are saying, why should we have public speaking? Why should we have communication at the university level? That's been a big fight, and it's been a big fight in the US for a long time. I'm curious if anyone wants to be brave and just shout out some guesses. Don't look it up. How long has communication or speech been a subject that you could study and major in at a US university? Does anybody want to guess how long communication departments have been around in the US? Give me a year. When do you think the first one was founded? Just off the top of your head. There's no right or wrong answer yet. 1830. Okay, so you thought maybe about 200 years old or so. Would anybody go later than that? Shout out some years. Okay, 1780, so around the time of the Revolutionary War. Would anybody go later than that? 1784. We're playing The Price is Right, apparently. Would anybody go later than 1820? 1950. There is a correct answer to this question. I didn't expect any of you to know it, but I think you'll find the answer interesting, especially when I get into the history of it. The correct answer is 1914. And the reason why it's 1914 is because there was a bitter divorce that happened. What happened is that there were people teaching public speaking in the United States. Rhetoric has had a long history. The founders and the framers of the US Constitution have been people who were well steeped in rhetoric and philosophy and took rhetoric very seriously. Some of our early treatises of government actually refer to things from Plato and Cicero and big figures like that. People who are teaching communication in the university level, if they were teaching speech, they were teaching it primarily in English departments up until 1914. And they were teaching speech in very particular ways. There were some ways that were better than others. But there were professors of communication, they just didn't have their own discipline, and they were teaching speech. And they were teaching it under English departments, and their colleagues in English were not too fond of them. They weren't very nice to them either. What happened is you had people who were teaching speech, and then you had the people who were teaching composition, and people who were teaching literature. And there are some people around in the 21st century who are still this way. It was much more common in the 18th and 19th century that if you were teaching literature, you thought of yourself as pretty high and mighty. You thought of yourself as carrying on the great works of literature, and you knew exactly what those works were. You probably read them if you took AP English in high school. Shakespeare, Chaucer, Milton, whoever. You're reading these great works of literature. So there are people working together in English departments, and the people teaching literature and the people teaching writing were looking at those speech people over there in the corner and saying, yeah, you think what you do is important, but I'm doing the real important work. I'm teaching culture. I'm teaching people how to be civil. I'm teaching people how to be mannered. I'm teaching them ethics. And the people who were teaching speech were basically being treated like second-class citizens in English departments. A lot of our history and theory of public speaking this semester has come directly out of Aristotle's rhetoric. A lot of what the English tradition came out of was Aristotle's poetics, which was literature and poetry and great works that were passed down from generation to generation. And what happened is over time, the speech communication instructors in English departments were basically being treated like second-class citizens. They were being laughed at by their colleagues. They weren't being given good resources. Their classes weren't making, or they were getting cut. And they got pretty tired and pretty fed up of being treated as second-class citizens in English departments. So what happened is in 1914, there was a meeting of the National Council of Teachers of English. This is an organization that still exists. I would imagine that if you take classes from some of the English folks at UND, some of them belong to the NCTE. And the NCTE had an annual convention where professors from around the country got together to share their research, to share strategies about teaching, to strategize about the future of the profession. And what happened is things had gotten so bad for the speech instructors in English departments that they walked out of that annual convention. They walked out mad. And they walked out and they decided, you know what, we're tired of being part of this organization, we're going to start our own. So what they did is they started up the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking. They decided we're going to create our own conference, we're going to create our own organization, and we're going to lobby universities to separate out our tradition of speech from the other tradition of English where people are taking us not so seriously and treating us not so well. So what happened is they actually lobbied to different universities around the country to try and get what they called speech communication departments started. And those have only been around for about 100 years, which in the scheme of a university is not a very long time. But part of what's really interesting about that divorce and part of what gets me excited about teaching you all public speaking is what happened after that. As you could imagine, the people who started this organization were pretty successful, at least some of the time. They lobbied to particular universities, and they actually won. They were able to create departments like the one we have here at UND. They were able to create departments like the one at Minnesota, and the one at Wisconsin, and the one at Syracuse, and the one at Texas. They were able to create those departments, but there were other universities who said, hell no, we're not buying it. We actually stand with our English professors. If you all want to leave, good riddance. To this day, if you go to any one of the Ivy League schools in the United States, you will not find a speech communication department there. The reason for that is because a lot of the people in English departments there held up this tradition of we are the great gatekeepers of literature and culture and knowledge and ethics. And if you want to go teach speech, that's cute, but you go do it somewhere else. And so the speech teachers did. They got up and they decided to do it somewhere else. And where did they do it? They did it mostly at land-grant universities. I'm curious if any of you are familiar with what a land-grant university is. Do you want to try and explain it? Not quite, but close. Yeah, you have the right idea. So part of what you said is right. The government actually gave land to each state in the union. So all 50 states have a land-grant university. It was land granted to build a university with the sole purpose of educating people who otherwise wouldn't have access to a college education. So you said that you thought UND was the land grant for North Dakota. I'm sorry that it's actually not. It's that other school down the road, and that's why it's not quite, but close. So the other school down the road is our land grant university, the one off of 29, about an hour south of us. But UND is still a public university, and where speech communication mostly took off was at the public universities. It struggled a lot at the private universities for the reason of basically elitism. They were saying, we already teach English, and that's all our students need to know. The people who started the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking said, you know what? We actually want to be part of that land-grant mission or that public university spirit. And so a lot of land grants and a lot of public universities like UND actually have speech communication departments. And the land grants in particular were interesting because they were designed for people who had otherwise never gone to college. The land grant actually happened during the Civil War. At the height of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln passed this law, signed off on this law that would give land to the universities. And they were created specifically to attract people from agriculture and mechanical industries. And by mechanical industries, they mostly meant getting people ready for the army. So it was people, it was farmers, it was the urban and rural poor, it was people who otherwise were not able to go to college. And part of why the speech communication tradition took off at public universities was because those people had been historically disenfranchised. They didn't have money. They didn't have power. They often didn't have land. They didn't have status. They didn't have much of a voice in government. And the universities that took on communication said, you know what? We actually want to give our students a voice. We want them to be able to speak up about issues that matter to them and matter to our communities, because otherwise states like North Dakota and Wisconsin are going to get passed over by states like New York and Pennsylvania and Michigan. And so you all are part of a tradition of trying to make speech communication to help you find your voice, and also to help you find that voice at a low cost. One of the other things about land-grant universities and most public universities is that tuition has historically been much lower than at private universities, and that's to give you all access. I can tell you that my training came from Minnesota, Texas A&M, and Penn State, all three of which are land-grant universities. I'm the youngest of 4 kids. I would not be here at UND. I probably wouldn't have graduated undergrad or even gone to undergrad had I not been a product of 3 different land-grant institutions. So you're part of a tradition that is designed to help you all speak up and to help you all be taken seriously by people who have historically had more access to resources, more power, more ability to speak up. That's one of the reasons why I still get excited teaching public speaking after nearly a decade of teaching it. Now, so these speech communication departments started up around the country. They didn't happen everywhere. They mostly happened in places where they were allowed to happen. And the new public speaking instructors had to figure out, okay, so we have to create a university curriculum that somebody could major in. We have to be able to justify our existence in order to keep this thing that we've built for ourselves. And so they had to figure out, if we're going to teach speech as something that somebody should study at the university level, how should we go about teaching it? Well, they looked mostly to the same people we've been looking to. They looked to Plato, they looked to Aristotle, they looked to Cicero, they looked to Quintilian. They looked to Cato the Elder's idea of the good person, or in his time, the good man, speaking well. And if they were teaching classes in communication or in speech communication at the time, what they were often teaching were good models of what they thought were good men speaking well, which usually meant US presidents or maybe world leaders like Winston Churchill. So if you were taking public speaking in, say, 1920, 1930, you might be reading speeches from Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Jefferson. You might be listening to FDR's fireside chats on the radio and analyzing them. You might be asked, instead of writing your own speeches, to deliver a speech that somebody else has already given and to try to give it in a really good delivery in a really grandiose manner. And so this is often how they taught speech communication for the next 50 years or so, right up until about the 1960s. This divorce happened in 1914, and if you were taking this class in the early part of the 20th century, you would probably be analyzing speeches written by old dead white guys. And that was some of the criticism that started to happen. What these public speaking teachers started to realize was that what they were teaching worked pretty well for them when they were being trained. Most of the professors were old white guys, most of whom had been trained by old white guys. At the time, most of the students were also white men. There weren't a lot of women, there weren't a lot of students of color in universities yet. That would actually happen later. And what started to happen is over time, they started realizing their models for what speeches were good speeches and their models for what to teach in class and how to teach it weren't really working so well for everybody. They weren't really working to explain what was going on the ground. So in the 1960s, we had a couple different critiques that happened simultaneously. The first one was what I was just talking about, that a lot of their models were studying old dead white guys, or sometimes old living white guys like FDR. A lot of people in the latter half of the 20th century started studying Hitler, and they were trying to understand how was Hitler so powerful. If we have this idea from Cato the Elder that the ideal public speaker is the good person speaking well, most of us agree that Hitler was a bad person who was able to speak very well, and that was part of why he had so much influence. So there are a lot of people saying, we're going to study these speeches of old dead white guys, but that's not really explaining a whole lot. We know that there are other people who historically have spoken and have made a difference. And so there was an effort to reclaim lost traditions of women speakers. In particular, I have the image of Sappho up here. Sappho wrote a lot of poetry, but also was one of the famous women orators of Greece when there weren't a lot of women who were allowed to speak in ancient Greece. There weren't a lot of women who were allowed to speak in ancient Rome in the public sphere. There were also people talking at the time about people from all over the world. If our tradition's only coming from Greece and Rome, what about famous speeches from Africa? What about famous speeches from China? What about famous speeches from Central and South America? We probably have speakers there. But at the same time, it's also interesting to observe what's happening culturally in the United States, that we're seeing not just more students who are women and more students of color, but we're also seeing a rise of lots of activism for people whose voices historically have not been heard all that much. So in the 1960s, simultaneously, or more or less simultaneously, you have the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, you've got the feminist movement, and you've got the anti-war movement. And who, by and large, is leading those movements? A lot of times it's young people. A lot of times it's college students. It's people trying to figure out, okay, you have these models from Greece and Rome that say if I'm going to be a good public speaker, and if I'm going to have my voice heard, and I'm going to have influence in the public sphere, that I have to be able to be civil first in order to participate in the civic. And what you're seeing in the 1960s is actually the opposite of that. There's a whole lot of civil disobedience. There's people burning bras. There's people burning draft cards. There's people engaging in nonviolent resistance and getting fire hosed. There are people who are making a difference who are not modeling their speeches after Cicero and trying to sound like Cicero in the 1960s. And so one of the critiques is that we need to expand our thinking of who gets to speak and who we look up to as good examples of public speakers. There's another critique that happens around the same time. In addition to the protests happening in the 1960s, we also see a technological revolution. And that technological revolution has been some time coming, but it really expands in the 50s and 60s with technology that is very closely related to communication. This is the first time where we really see mass communication beyond the print media of the newspaper. We start seeing radio, we start seeing television, we start seeing movies, we start hearing music. And so the same students who are pushing their professors to say, your models of civic and community engagement don't account for the protest movements, are also saying things like, well, what happens if we take the tools that you're giving us to study speeches, and instead of just looking at speeches, what if we apply those to speeches given in movies? Maybe there are some fictional movie speeches that are really powerful, and we want to analyze those. Maybe we want to do a rhetorical criticism of a television show. Maybe we want to do a rhetorical criticism of anti-war posters and propaganda. Maybe we want to do a rhetorical criticism of songs that we're hearing on the radio. There's been a lot of rhetorical criticism in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s of hip-hop as a genre, using some of the same tools that speech teachers were teaching in the 40s and 50s and 60s, but expanding to new areas. And so one of the criticisms is that the tools for studying speech also apply to other technologies. So you have communication expanding well beyond the medium of speech. There's another critique that happens at the same time, and it's similar to the critique of studying a whole bunch of old dead white guys. So in addition to looking to the good men or the good people speaking well from Cato the Elder, a lot of the people who are teaching and writing about speech and why it's worthy of study and why it matters and how to do it well, we're studying it from the perspective of trying to figure out the impact that speech has on people. So there are a lot of people who could point to FDR's fireside chat or Hitler's speeches or other speeches that people were giving and saying, you know, speech really seems to have an impact on people, especially when we can reach a really large audience. And they were studying speech mostly with two criteria in mind. Almost every study that you would see if you looked at a speech or communication journal in the early half of the 20th century is going to be looking at one of two things, and usually at both. It's going to be looking at the speaker's intent, or it's going to be looking at the effect that that speech has upon its audience. And the reason for that is probably similar to going back to that idea from Cato the Elder of the good person speaking well. A good person is generally well-intentioned. Speaking well, if you're able to do it, usually has an impact on an audience. If you're a good person but you can't speak well, chances are you're not going to be able to accomplish a whole lot with your speech because you don't have the tools to get people to listen to you. So there are a lot of people studying that, and there are a lot of people teaching speech as that's the way you teach speech. We look for speeches that have good intentions and good effects. In 1965, there was a man named Ed Black who taught at the University of Wisconsin. Some of the people who mentored me were students of Ed Black at the University of Wisconsin, so this isn't that long removed from our history. But Ed Black comes around, and he's going to take that model of intent and effect, and he's going to challenge that. And I imagine that if Ed Black is teaching speech the way that Robin Williams and Dead Poets Society is teaching poetry, that this is what Ed Black's classroom would look like if you were a grad student of his in the 1960s.
Gentlemen, open your text, page 21 of the introduction. Ms. Perry, will you read the opening paragraph of the preface entitled Understanding Poetry?
Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, we must first be fluent with its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech, then ask two questions. One, how artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And two, how important is that objective? Question one rates the poem's perfection. Question two rates its importance. And once these questions are answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple matter. If the poem's score for perfection is plotted on the horizontal of a graph, and its importance is plotted on the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields the measure of its greatness. A sonnet by Byron might score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, would score high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great. As you proceed through the poetry in this book, practice this rating method. As your ability to evaluate poems in this manner grows, so will your enjoyment and understanding of poetry.
Excellent. That's what I take of Mr. J. Evans Pritchard. We're not playing pipe. We're talking about poetry. How can you describe poetry like American bandstand? I like choir, and I give him a 42, but I can't dance to it. I want you to rip out that page. Go on. Rip out the entire page. You heard me. Rip it out. Rip it out. Go on. Rip it out. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Gentlemen, tell you what, not just tear out that page, tear out the entire introduction. I want it gone. History. Leave nothing of it. Rip it out. Rip. Be gone, J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. Rip. Shred the tear. Rip it out. I want to hear nothing but ripping of Mr. Pritchard. We'll preparate it. Put it on a roll.
That's essentially what Ed Black did to the field of communication in 1965. He said, take everything you think you know about speech, take everything you think you know about communication, and forget it all. And the reason for that is because he's going to challenge this model of studying speeches and analyzing speeches and the only speeches that matter if they are both well-intentioned and have a good effect on their audience. Now, before we go with Ed Black's criticism of why that might be a bad thing, why might people have done that in the first place? What would have people think that a good speech has to have both good intent and an effect upon the audience? Why would people want to study speech that way? Go ahead. Yeah, a lot of our speeches that we study are persuasive speeches. If I were to ask you on the first day of class, what are the speeches that you most remember? You might not remember who gave the speech, you might not remember which speech it was, but it was probably a speech that had some style that was pretty impactful on you. And you're able to remember it over time. We want to think that speech makes a difference in people's lives, and for the most part it does. The reason why Ed Black is very critical of this method of teaching speech by rating it in intent and effect is essentially that it's impossible to quantify something that is inherently qualitative. If we're going to try and figure out what constitutes a good speech, that's something that we might have to come by subjectively. That's something that we might not all agree on. You might give it a 68, somebody else might give it an 84, someone else might give it a 92. But aside from that, there are speeches that are maybe really well-intentioned that don't have an effect. There are speeches that are very poorly intentioned that have a significant effect. And if we only study speeches that satisfy both of those criteria, there's a lot of stuff that we're missing out on. And so Ed Black is going to come at his fellow speech instructors, his fellow professors from around the country, and he's going to say, if you're only using Cato the Elder's good person speaking well as your template, that limits what you can see by way of what constitutes a good speech. And to demonstrate this, he pulls out a speech called the Coatesville Address. The Coatesville Address was given by a man named John J. Chapman. John J. Chapman was a famous abolitionist in the United States. He fought against the cause of slavery. He gave a really big, profound, in Ed Black's estimation, speech about abolishing slavery and some of the horrors of what slavery is and why it's bad for society. And Ed Black took a look at this speech and he said, this speech is way ahead of its time. This speech is kind of brilliant. This speech is really daring for the moment that Chapman gave it in. Chapman gave it at a time when the country wasn't quite ready to hear this speech. So Ed Black comes across a copy of this speech text, and then he learns that Chapman gave this speech to an audience of 3 people in a barn in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, which is about an hour away from Philly. And he said it's such a shame that historians would render this not a good speech because it had functionally 0 impact. It was a really powerful speech, and it doesn't hold up to the standard expectations of ethos, pathos, and logos. It doesn't really resonate in the same way that speech teachers were teaching it. But you can't just quantify what constitutes a good speech. It's more of an art than a science. And so he's going to challenge other people and say you can't necessarily judge a speech based on the effect that it has, and you can't necessarily know a person's intent. It gets even weirder than Chapman giving this speech to an audience of 3 people. Chapman gives this speech in the middle of his life, and right around the time that he dies, he actually goes back on some of the things that he said in the Coatesville Address. He actually becomes kind of a racist. He becomes kind of a bigot. And at the end of his life, his intent is something that most of us today would be pretty horrified by. But at the time that he gave this speech, his intent was really good. And so one of the questions that Ed Black asks is, can you ever know a person's intent if people are constantly changing? You're probably a different person than who you were 2 or 5 or 10 years ago. If I ask you 10 years from now who you were in college, you'd probably say you're a different person as well. So we can't necessarily know a person's intent, and we can't necessarily measure the effect that something has. Sometimes a speech will not have a big effect in the immediate moment. People, a president or some world leader will give this famous speech and expect a reaction and not get it. And then over time, history is kind to that speaker and kind to that speech, and we remember it much better than we did in the moment, and our attitude actually changes. So Ed Black is saying we can't just rely on the criteria of intent and effect to study and understand speech. Now, given that I've given you that challenge, I'm going to ask you a question that's probably pretty similar to one that you might see on your final. I'm not the one who writes your final, your lab instructor is. But nevertheless, This is a question that might appear on your final. We've covered a lot of history and theory in this class. I've given you 4 of those theories up on the board here. One of those theories is something that Ed Black is probably going after, maybe not directly, but there's one theory here that intent and effect generally is explained differently than how Ed Black would explain it. So I'm curious, which of these theories do you think Ed Black is most critiquing or most concerned about? If you can, show me on your fingers 1, 2, 3, or 4. Try not to look around. Just try and use your best judgment. A, B, C, or D, 1, 2, 3, or 4. I'm waiting for a couple more shows of hands. Seeing a lot of 3s and 4s. Seeing a couple 2s. I don't think I'm seeing any 1s. Okay. I'll tell you that you all did better than my class yesterday with this, but that the vast majority of you actually got this question wrong. And I'm saying that not to make you feel bad, but probably to encourage you to review a little bit. The correct answer here is actually number 2, or B, the communication model. And the reason for that is because what the communication model says is that if the speaker is well-intentioned, they encode their values, their attitudes, their beliefs into a particular message. That message gets passed to a receiver who then decodes it, and that receiver decides what to do with it. That receiver decides if they agree with that message, if they're going to act upon that message. And if you remember, the communication model, when it works properly, a source encodes a message that is passed through a channel to a receiver. And that receiver typically is a passive recipient in this model. They don't really have a whole lot of choice over the message that they receive, and they don't usually push back, except for when that model is critiqued and when that model doesn't work in that linear fashion. So if you remember, I gave you an example of when the communication model doesn't really help us all that much with understanding questions of value or understanding ethics. The example I gave you was my master's thesis, and I talked about how there were these media professionals who were spewing hate speech over the radio and in magazines or newspapers. And they not only said, these people are bad, but over the radio they said, go to this location, there's a group of Tutsis hiding out in this location, go there and cut the tall trees, which we all knew was a euphemism for hack them to death with machetes. And we had a conversation over whether the source there could possibly be well-intentioned, but also more importantly, whether the receiver had any power to resist that message. Ed Black is very concerned about both intent and effect, and especially when we have people like Hitler in the equation, especially when we have people like those Rwandan media executives in the equation. He's going to be very resistant to determining that the only good speeches are ones that are well-intentioned and have a profound effect on the audience. Now, I'll tell you that for the last 50 years or so, the field has been trying to grapple with Ed Black telling them to rip that chapter out of their textbook. You can't really talk about effect because we can't really know, or you can't really talk about intent because we can't really know it. You can't really talk about effect because we can't always demonstrate it, and there are some speeches that are good or some texts that are good, even if they don't have much of an effect. Now, I'll tell you that that's a really hard thing to do if you are a communication scholar, because a lot of us still have an impulse that we want to talk about one or both of those things, and Ed Black basically said that you can't. And so if you take a class in communication, an upper-level class in communication, you're going to have this question over whether the study of communication can wrestle with questions of intent or effect. And I'll tell you that I came down pretty hard on the no side. You're not allowed to talk about those things for all the reasons we just said. And then I took a class with Steve Brown, who worked pretty closely with Ed Black. And he said, I'm going to get a little violent here, but I want you to think about what this means for communication scholars. If you pictured your text that you're studying, whether it's a speech, whether it's a television show, whether it's a book, whether it's a movie, whether it's a song, think of that speech or that text as a dog. Now, if we get rid of intent and we get rid of an effect, we can think of intent kind of like the dog's brain or the dog's head. We can think of effect as the dog's tail. The dog likes the message, the dog doesn't like the message. If you get rid of both of those parts, what are you left with? And he said, you're left with the worst parts of the dog. There's not a whole left you can talk about when you're analyzing communication if you can't talk about intent or effect. And so for the last 50 years or so, the field has been saying, don't talk about those things. But there's been a little bit of a resurgence in both of them lately. So a few years ago, about 4 years ago, my friends Amos Kive and Davis Hauck put out a book called The Effects of Rhetoric and the Rhetorics of Effects, where they're saying, Ed Black tried to declare intent and effect dead. Maybe we want to recover that. I wouldn't be surprised if a year or two from now, another book came out called The Intents of Rhetoric and the Rhetoric of Intents. But nevertheless, we're trying to figure out why different communication texts matter in the 21st century. And that's not limited to speeches. That could be any number of things. So what happened, as I told you, in the 1950s and the 1960s, there was a proliferation of people studying communication from a variety of perspectives. Not only did they study movies and television and music, they also decided we're not necessarily interested in looking at the public speech where one speaker gets up and gives a massive speech in front of a large audience. What we're actually interested in is all kinds of communication. We're going to look at things like interpersonal communication. What happens when I just talk to you? We're going to look at things like organizational communication. If you're in a campus organization, a fraternity, a sorority, an interest group on campus, how do organizational dynamics work out? If you are religious, how does communication operate in religious institutions? If you are a journalist, how does it operate in journalism? If you are in health communication, how do you communicate messages about what people should or shouldn't do? Do you tell people that they shouldn't vaccinate their kids? What are the ethics around that? And so the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking expanded to become the Speech Communication Association. And in the 1980s, they actually decided to drop the name speech entirely. So remember that in 1914, when that bitter divorce happened, the people who were teaching communication were all former public speaking instructors. About 105 years later, only a handful of us actually teach public speaking, and the ones who do, by and large, it's not the only thing that they do. They study other things. So I teach you all public speaking, but my upper level classes are on intercultural conflict and communication and violence. So what happened is in the 1980s, the organization that was the National Association of Academic Teachers of Public Speaking was the Speech Communication, decided to drop that name and become the National Communication Association in order to encompass all of the different things that people studied and all of the different ways that they studied them. And so there were people who were behind that change from SCA to NCA who showed up at the national conference wearing shirts that said speechless, that they were actually trying to kind of do away with their public speaking roots and focus on other things beyond communication as just one person giving one speech to one live audience. And so what happened is what we have today in the 21st century. The National Communication Association actually has 48 different divisions. If you go to the National Communication Association website, you will see all of those different interest groups. There's a lot of them. And there's only one of those divisions that still focuses on speeches. It's called the Public Address Division. I'm a member of that division, and even within the Public Address Division, a lot of the things that people study are not speeches anymore. We have lots of people studying mass communication, interpersonal communication, intercultural communication. And we have people at universities all over the country and all over the world who are studying a whole bunch of different things simultaneously. So I'll tell you that I'm trained in the rhetoric tradition, which is kind of closely related to that speech communication tradition. All of my colleagues upstairs are trained as social scientists. We actually have very little in common with what we study and how we study it. It sometimes makes for challenges within departments if I'm studying group communication and violence and you're studying risk and crisis communication and drone technology. So what happens is about every 10 years, there are people in the discipline who freak out and say, we started as this one thing. We're glad that not all of communication is just public speaking anymore, but we've got 50 different divisions, and they all do different things, and they don't really understand what the other divisions do. They're not very good at talking to one another. They're not very good at working together. Maybe this umbrella of communication that was holding us all together should actually fall apart, and we should splinter off and divide into separate different divisions. There are other people who say, no, we actually need to call ourselves communication. We need to be united around that. Because A, if you're going to start cutting, what do you cut? There are people whose jobs depend on them being able to study what they study. But also the knowledge of the field of communication is broader than it perhaps has ever been before. If we're studying communication in a variety of different contexts with a variety of different texts, we're learning new things about how communication operates in the world today. So I have colleagues who are studying things like social media communication, fake news. If you start cutting things, then you're missing out on that knowledge. So I share this with you today so that you all have a sense of how communication is more than just speech in the 21st century. I told you that there's 48 different divisions. I'm a member of about 5 of them. There's a lot of divisions in communication that might be of interest to some of you. If you haven't yet declared a major yet, it's not my job here today to tell you that you should declare a communication major. But if you're interested in something like sports journalism, if you're interested in something like marketing, advertising, PR, international, intercultural communication, there are divisions for just about every single aspect of communication. There's a lot you can do with communication. You'd be in good company with other people. I'll also want to tell you a little bit more about what our department does, because I don't want you all to leave this class thinking public speaking is the only thing that communication does. Some of you may be interested in upper level courses. So some of those upper level courses I've listed for you here. We have our subject areas. A lot of what we do in our department is strategic comm, advertising, and PR. We have a lot of people who do digital stuff. I do stuff on violence. There's a lot of stuff that you can study in our upper level classes, and you might not do a whole lot of public speaking in those upper level classes. There's a lot more that communication departments offer, and part of what I'm trying to get around is that stigma that the basic course of public speaking is all that we do and that we're just a slacker major. But also, even if you're not going to take upper level communication classes, even if you're not going to declare a major in communication, I also want to let you know of some opportunities that are available to you as UND students. Whether you are a communication major or not, there are some groups that you might want to be a part of. If you're in business school, we have a couple devoted to public relations and advertising. There are lots of internships and careers that our former students have had, whether they are majors or not. We've had students partner with big organizations of journalism. We just had a couple students of ours get hired in Bismarck and elsewhere in the state as journalists at a local paper. We have students who have worked for NFL and NBA and MLB teams doing sports communication. So we have lots of things that are available to you, and one of the things that our department does is likes to set students up with internships that will then set them up with careers. Whether you major in communication or not, I know the person who's in charge of that. I can put you in charge with someone who might be able to get you an internship to help get your foot in the door. Ultimately, what I want you to realize, though, is that there's a lot that communication offers. And so regardless of your experience in public speaking, I want you to recognize that there's value in what communication does, not just at the university, but also in partnership with organizations outside of the university. So I'm going to leave you today with a little bit of that. Again, it's not my job to necessarily tell all of you that you should take our classes or major in communication. I hope that at least some of you consider it. But really, what I really want to leave you with today is a sense of how speech has been a part of communications history and how speech can continue to help you beyond this class. So you all are going to be leaving this class soon. I know some of you are very excited about that. I also know that there's a lot of challenges that I've been up against since day one. And I want to tell you all that I've appreciated having you. I hope that even if I can't get you to love public speaking right now, that I can at least get you to hate it a little bit less or to be able to do it a little bit better. You remember that the title of your textbook that I wrote for you is called Finding Your Voice. I don't think that's something that you all can do in 16 weeks of lecture and lab. I think that's something that we can provide the fundamentals for, as the course title suggests. So I'm giving you a lot of tools and resources. I also want to let you know that I'm available to you as a resource once you leave this class. If you have speeches that you're going to give in the future, I hope that you'll have notes from lecture and lab. I hope that you'll keep a copy of your OER textbook. I hope that you will keep practicing the skills that you have, because I see public speaking as a lifelong skill that you all will need to continue to develop. So I'll leave you there, and I'll wish you luck as you finish up the semester.